Hi there, this is Lisa Connors-Vogt, and welcome to the Founders and Startups podcast. I'm excited to bring you our guest today, Jaime-Alexis Fowler, founder of EmpowerWork, a nonprofit organization that provides confidential and free support to anyone who's dealing with adverse work experiences. And before Jaime-Alexis comes on and joins us, I want to share a little bit about my background in the podcast. So I'm an executive and leadership coach, and I love to help leaders create more fulfilling careers and lives and help them to become even more effective at the jobs that they currently have. And I also love to work with groups to help them become higher performing. And you can learn more about me at everbetteryou.com. So I'm creating the Founders and Startups podcast to bring you stories from individuals who've taken an idea from concept to creating a full-out organization that's thriving. And my hope is that you'll be inspired by their stories and it will help you to create your organizations, or that you can take away some tips that will help to accelerate your career or your business. So without further ado, here is Jaime-Alexis Fowler. I'm going to have her join our video stream. Hey there, Jaime-Alexis.
Hi, great to be on.
Thanks for being here. You are the second interview guest for the Founders and Startups podcast, so it's kind of exciting. Thanks for being on this journey with me.
Absolutely. Well, I'm delighted, and I love your mission around empowering people. I think we're pretty aligned.
Yeah. Thanks for being here. So tell me a little bit about your background and what led you to start the organization that you did.
Absolutely. So EmpowerWork really emerged from a conversation around the time of the Susan Fowler Uber memo, which I think many of us are probably familiar with. In 2017, when headlines were raging about various experiences in the Me Too movement, I was increasingly having conversations with folks in my wider network about challenges that they were facing in their workplace. And as a longtime manager and someone who cared deeply about equitable, healthy experiences in workplaces, I had sort of become this go-to for folks in my network to hey, talk to me, Alexis, if you're facing something, and she might be helpful. And in this one particular conversation, someone I didn't know but was connected to me through my wider network, I left thinking, what she needed was probably weeks earlier than we had connected. She was first in her family to go to college, join the industry that she was in, which happened to be tech. And she was working in this 10-person startup. And there were very few resources in the company and very few that she had in her personal network. And she was really stuck. She was grappling with student loans. She wasn't sure, what it would look like if she left her job. And yet she'd faced this really, really negative situation and didn't have anybody to turn to about it. So we talked through what she had faced and ways in which she might be able to handle things going forward. And ultimately, at the end of the conversation, as we ended, I turned to my husband and I said, there's got to be some kind of crisis text line for work. And I should figure out what that is, because what she needed was probably that. It was probably like 3 weeks prior. And as we started digging into, a Google search, an hour of Google searching later, and I had not found anything that was accessible. Anything that existed was either tied to someone's company, so your company had to be paying for the service, or was priced inaccessibly for most working Americans. And that really started this journey, which has now landed where we are today with EmpowerWork.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a fantastic story. Tell me a little bit more. You said that people will go to you with their stories or when they had challenges. What's behind that?
I think as someone who has always believed really strongly in the importance of teams, the importance of human relationships in workplaces. I've come at that from a management perspective, certainly in terms of how I structure my teams, how I approach creating healthy environments for coworkers, for colleagues, and also from a structural perspective. What do policies look like? How do we make sure that things are in place so that people feel supported? But never from an official HR, kind of capacity. Much more from a leadership, leading by example within teams. And so as a result, I think I just kind of became known as someone who was good to go to with challenges.
Right. Okay. And so how did you go from that concept to creating the organization that you're heading up today, Empower Work?
I certainly did not start out thinking that I was going to start an organization.
Okay.
It really came out of this question of like, for me, this like, okay, this need seems to be there, and yet I'm not finding anything that seems to address this need. And that doesn't mean that something that has to exist. That there could be really good reasons why there hadn't been a company that was in this sort of gap that I'm describing. But as I started looking into it, I was taking steps to understand it a bit more each time. So as I started with this question, like I said, it started with a Google search, and then it moved into okay, let's like look at the market, look at the landscape a little bit more. That then led me to, okay, let's really understand like what do people need? So I'm not finding this in the landscape. Doesn't mean that there's a need for it. What are the pain points that folks are actually experiencing in workplaces? And what do they do when they face those challenges? So we started with a simple survey, and then we started sharing that across industries, communities, to get a diverse set of backgrounds, whether it's education levels, industries, parts of the United States. We also wanted diversity of experiences. So of course, as I mentioned, the Me Too headlines were raging, but we also found that a lot of times these were a constellation of related issues. We're looking at sort of what are all the facets that people are experiencing, and then what do they do when they face those? Where do they turn? What are they looking for? And we identified some clear gaps. So one was that folks understandably either didn't trust what was provided by the company or didn't have access to a resource. 40 million Americans work in workplaces with fewer than 100 people. And usually in those instances, folks have little HR or other support. And those companies are typically not going to buy any sort of resource to provide for their employees. And then on top of that, you have this issue of trust. So even if you work somewhere where there may be a resource provided, folks don't necessarily trust that. If you're debating, what to do in light of an adverse experience you just had with your manager, are you really going to turn to the company as the source of helping solve that? Most likely not. And then when you layer on top of that different experiences, so if you're less represented or have less social capital in your workplace, you're not only more likely to face these sort of adverse experiences, you are less likely to trust the company resources, and you are more likely to feel isolated given what you're facing. And so we saw that the outcomes of those situations when folks were both less represented and didn't have access to resources were pretty profoundly negative. People would leave jobs with no next jobs lined up. They would take pay cuts. They would leave industries altogether. And we saw this real cumulative ripple impact, negative ripple effect, both emotionally and economically.
Yeah, interesting. It's so sad that the people who are really who I would consider the victims in these situations are often the ones that have to end up leaving the organization or feel that they need to leave the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what were the next steps?
So from there, understanding the gap, we looked at, okay, what do people do? And we found that people were, picking up their phones and like texting someone they knew from the bathroom, like, hey, I'm going to text my friend and talk to my friend about it, or I'm going to jump into this WhatsApp group, or, whatever that looked like. And that could be helpful. Sometimes it was really good for venting. Sometimes it was really good for sort of that immediate, like, yeah, that doesn't sound like it's okay. But again, the sort of gap that we saw was that folks then were sort of like, okay, well, what do I do? I just got the surprise performance improvement plan. I don't even know what a PIP is. I text my friend about it. Well, she's also, same point in her career as me. Neither of us have ever had a PIP. And I don't know if I'm getting this PIP because I'm a woman of color and I'm the only woman of color on my team, and there are other factors going into that, or like there's a performance issue and I want to address that. And so we saw that there was this gap in a combination of emotional and tactical support, but certainly what people wanted was something that wasn't going to be overheard. You're like texting your friend from the bathroom. You don't want to pick up the phone and call someone. And so from there, we basically said, hey, let's test this. We think we see a gap in the resource. We see a way to meet people where they are by providing SMS or web chat with this combination of emotional and tactical support. Let's test it. So I, put together a quick pilot and printed off some flyers at Office Depot.
Yes, Office Depot, right?
I walked around the streets of San Francisco posting what I thought were like very sketchy looking 8.5 by 11 flyers. And, just on like telephone poles, and someone pulled out their phone and said like, oh, can I take a picture of that? It looks really cool. And all it said was, tough work situation, ? Connect with a trained peer counselor, and it gave a phone number. And we didn't say whether to text or whether to call. We just provided the long code. And what we saw was 90% of people texted that number who engaged with us. And within a couple of weeks, we had folks from 10 different states. And I don't attribute the 8.5 11 by 11 flyers to the folks out of state. We started doing some digital tests as well.
This is amazing. This is like guerrilla marketing at its best, right? I'm just going to go photocopy something and hang it on a telephone pole and see what happens. Wow, you struck a nerve.
Well, we wanted to see. We wanted to particularly go. I was doing those near bus stops, because we were thinking about like where are people thinking about something they've just experienced at work, or they're on their way to work. And so typically that's like you're on the bus or you're on the train or you're in your break room. And so how do we really show up? And actually one of them was like at food trucks. We posted flyers.
So smart.
Near food trucks. So like people were on break over lunch and stuff. And about a year later, actually, someone sent a picture of that 8.5 by 11 flyer. The food trucks had laminated it and put it in the bathroom and had been up for like a year, which we didn't know.
Wow, that's incredible.
So it was, and we saw, this pretty immediate traction where folks would text us and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've never heard of you before. This is amazing. This is exactly what I need. And so we felt like we were onto something. But that doesn't mean that we needed to be an organization, doesn't mean that we needed to be structured in the way that we were. We just knew that this was addressing a need that clearly wasn't being filled.
Right. Wow. Okay. So many questions in my mind now about this. So that took a lot of time, a lot of personal time. And I assume we haven't talked about this yet, but did you have a full-time job when you were starting this up?
I had a full-time job and a 2-year-old. So the thing that people don't tell you is, I think as a newer-ish parent, my son at that point, I think, was going to bed at like 6:30 or 7. And so it was like, okay, bedtime would happen. And then, you're getting back online to do work. And I just happened to shift that evening time into in-depth interviews. I interviewed like 200 different folks from after we did the survey, I did interviews with, HR specialists, DE&I consultants, labor organizers, obviously folks who'd experienced adverse situations, to really build on the survey research that we had done. And it took a lot of time on the side of my full-time job, but it also was something I was so passionate about, and saw, in seeing this huge gap, really felt like, hey, something needs to be done. And so the question is, what is it? And all of my available time and brain power and energy outside of my job and being a partner and being a parent was going to that.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what was driving you personally. Why is this so important to you?
I think a big part of my personality has always been, from the time that I was really little, has always been, I think, overwhelmed and frustrated when I see inequity. And, whether that's like, when I was in high school, I stood up in front of a high school auditorium and called out a presentation because to me, it seemed like it was supposed to be a conversation about race, and it was really problematic in what was predominantly a white, small private school in North Dallas. And I've always felt like, hey, when you see something that's not working, stand up and say something about it, and do something about it and take action. And I've done that in the course of my career, within companies or within organizations, or certainly, from a political perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I looked at the pieces of where are there the possibilities to have the biggest impact, and that's been a theme in my career, workplaces are at the heart of that. Jobs are core to economic opportunity. And so seeing this massive discrepancy in available resources, and the outcomes that were happening as a result, to me, was this gap that I had to go work on.
Right.
And was sort of a driving force in that. And if you can help someone feel better and safer and more empowered in their workplace, if they can have the opportunity to not have that sort of gap. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of research around what women experience following sexual harassment, which can have huge economic ripple impacts. But this happens across a slate of of situations and issues in the workplace. And so that's fundamentally exacerbating inequality across the United States. And we have this promise that, like, if you work hard and you have a good job, you're going to be okay. And I think it's a false promise.
Yeah, that's true. So there's, it is very difficult to speak up when you see something going on that seems clearly wrong to you. Congratulations to you for having created a habit of speaking up and acting, taking action when you see something going on that isn't right. And I've found that it's difficult for me to speak out when I see something happening, but I've started to do it. And it becomes easier and easier, and even if you have like a one-off conversation with someone, there's this massive ripple effect.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to start a nonprofit in order to make a difference, but starting a nonprofit is a great thing to do. So That's great.
And the reason we started as a nonprofit was simply because we looked, like I said, like we did the market analysis. Like there's some great enterprise solutions that are selling to companies, whether reporting platforms or coaching at an enterprise level. And I think that's fabulous. But for me, that piece of the inequity is that if you work at a company that's willing and able to pay for something, that's awesome. And you're increasingly getting more and more resources for yourself. And you're probably more personally resourced because you're probably working at a company that pays well and is interested in investing in their employees in a variety of ways. But there's a huge gap that's happening for most working Americans. And that, to me, is, when you look at inequity across the United States, jobs are really at the front and center of a lot of how that's growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So have you ever been the victim of harassment yourself?
I wouldn't say harassment from a legal definition. I would say, certainly being a woman in the workplace, I've had a range of problematic encounters. And very early in my career, and I talk about this, I had a mentor who berated me so ferociously and in a public hallway that I felt like I had been physically punched. I mean, it was all verbal, but it was, I felt like I had just been physically impacted by the ferocity of his behavior. And it was extraordinarily intimidating. And no one said a thing. And that was a very formative experience for me. And I actually, I left that job. I'm part of that statistic, right? Like I figured out how to address the situation, but ultimately I left that situation.
Yeah. So I'm sure that informs some of your interactions today. So break down empower work for me. So let's start with who benefits from the work that you do there and how do they access your resources?
Yeah, so Empower Work is structured to address change in a couple of ways. Our mission is to really build healthy workplaces, and we do that in a couple of different ways. One is that we have this immediate SMS hotline. So anyone in the United States can connect with a trained peer counselor in under 2 minutes over SMS or web chat. So if folks have a smartphone, great. Sometimes they might want to use Wi-Fi. Some folks just want to use SMS. And we see incredible results from that. So people feel heard, supported, able to take a next step that works for them. And sometimes the next step is just like, hey, I'm going to go take myself for a walk before, before I have this conversation with my manager. And sometimes it is, hey, you know what? All of my coworkers are experiencing the same situation. I want to talk to coworkers about it. We want to organize and speak up about what we're experiencing. Sometimes it's taking legal action. We don't provide legal advice, but we will provide information about, hey, this is what you have a right to in this in your workplace. And we feel like that's really important to say, like, hey, this is, yes, it's normal to go through X, Y, or Z when there's a performance issue, or that seems surprising. Let's talk about some resources to get more information.
Yeah.
The SMS hotline is our immediate direct support. And then we provide that service through trained volunteers. So we have incredible volunteers from all over the United States who go through about 20 hours of training and believe, like we do, that folks should have support when they need it. And so they sign up week to week to provide that support. And so that's who folks connect with. And we see that actually having a pretty incredible impact for the folks who volunteer. We have volunteers who say, like, I just got a promotion because of what I've learned with Empower Work, because they learn really best practices in coaching that make them better peers, that make them better managers. And so it's a unique opportunity to give back and like help someone who may not have access to resources, and also develop skills yourself. So it's kind of a win-win. And we see that actually a lot of our volunteers take back things that they've learned into their workplaces. So we had a volunteer who was running HR for a company, and she actually took some of the facets of our training and used it across their entire company, which is pretty cool. And then the third way that we work on sort of this larger change of how do we build healthier workplaces, more equitable workplaces, is that we have access to unique data around worker voice. And we can look at aggregate trends, not individual conversations or individual data, but to really say, like, what are the trends and themes that we're seeing? How could we address things differently? And, one of the big themes that we see is that a lot of what people experience that feels profoundly unfair, they're surprised is not protected in any way. And I think there's a misconception, and certainly I had it before I started Empower Work. I'm not a lawyer, but we brought in a ton of different legal experts to work with us, and how little of what we experience in the workplace has any sort of means of recourse, which surprises a lot of folks, and can make things particularly challenging.
Yeah. And what do you do with that data? Are you using it internally, or are you sharing it with other organizations?
We use it internally to assess conversation quality and our service, which is really important. So, things like, 85% of our conversations complete, which for us is really successful, or 90% of people feel better after a conversation. Those are important data points. And then we also look at trends and themes, and we share those with researchers. So there are researchers who are looking, as I mentioned, at like the impact of these adverse situations. And so for us to say, hey, across 100,000 messages exchanged, here are the variety of issues that we see. Here are what people would like to see happen in light of what they've experienced. And that can help inform new approaches, new policies, new tools. And so we're in early stages of that. We wanted to reach an inflection point around the data, but as we grow, that's increasingly important for us to be able to share, like, hey, here are the top, trends and themes that we're seeing across industries or across geographies.
Yeah, it seems like HR managers would be really interested in having that data, and like the organization SHRM would love to have that, I suspect.
Yeah, I mean, we are approaching it in a very thoughtful way. And I should say, with all the conversations that are happening around data and how people use data right now, we hold our role as a confidential service as front and foremost. And what we want to do is make sure that we're learning from aggregate that we're seeing and sharing that, but never in a way that would compromise that.
Yeah, good to know. Yes. If someone's on the fence, they're not sure if you can help them or not, what do you advise them to go ahead and contact you and start having the conversation and find out if the resources are there?
I would say yes. I mean, it depends. There are two kind of trends that we see. One is, sometimes people will reach out to us with a question that may be possible to solve on Google, right? It's like, I just want to know, like, do I have a right to X, Y, or Z? And I would say that's a great question to use a search engine for.
Okay.
But I would say, these more complex questions of like, I don't know what to do because X, Y, and Z are happening, and it's not something I can just type into a search engine, or what I've found that's out there doesn't seem to apply to me. That's a great time to connect with us, to say, to explore with one of our counselors, what do I value? What's important? What are the questions I'm thinking about that are going on here? Do I have financial considerations that I need to take into account? And when you're in the midst, particularly at a heightened emotional state, if you're worried that you're about to lose your job, thinking through all these different factors in a safe environment with someone that has no skin in the game. It's not your partner who is going to have a particular perspective. It's not your friend. You can really have a straightforward and deep conversation with. I think we see, really shifting how people think about it. And so you have this space to kind of take a deep breath and say, like, okay, I can figure this out. And then, the resources to consider. And we'll even get into practices with folks. So like, okay, I'm thinking about disclosing my disability or my pregnancy to my employer, and I haven't really had favorable results. I want to think of, when I've shared things in the past that hasn't gone well. Okay, so I'm thinking about, do I disclose or not? And then I'm also thinking about, like, well, I get really nervous when I have these conversations. And so we'll practice with folks like, okay, how do you want to walk into that conversation? What do you need to have for yourself in advance? Maybe like your cup of tea or your walk. And then we'll even practice with folks, and people find that really helpful, and particularly that it's a written interface. Folks will sometimes have a little record. They can oh, great, I'm going to go home tonight and practice this a couple times and then have that conversation.
Wow, what an amazing resource. So that point is really important though too. They're not having audio conversations. It's not a telephone conversation. They're texting, or might it be email?
So it's all text or web chat.
Okay, great. So that if you're surrounded by coworkers, you can still be reaching out for help and nobody can hear you.
Yes. And actually, sometimes we'll have these pauses in a conversation, and the volunteer will be like, I guess maybe maybe that person dropped off. And then, 5 minutes later, they'll text back and say oh, sorry, my boss walked by, I had to set my phone down.
Yeah.
So people text us from the train, from the bus, from their desk. And that's one of the benefits, is that you can be in these spaces where you're thinking through what you're facing at work, and you're not going to be overheard.
Yeah, and there's less and less privacy in office setups these days with the open plans and co-working spaces. So, I love how you've set that up. And that was based on this early stage pilot that you did, right? You put the flyers out and you found that people were texting you.
It was a combination of, really deeply listening to what people needed and were already doing. So we did that original survey when I did the 200 plus interviews. We were paying attention to what's the behavior someone's already doing. And then they were going to a trusted resource. They were doing something in a way that wasn't going to be overheard. And then we wanted to validate that, is that something that's going to be true? And we're constantly listening, because maybe, if we do get folks who express an interest in having a phone, like a call, but it's very small. And, if that were to change, if we were seeing an increase in that, we would certainly think about offering it in a different way.
Right. Okay. So how do people reach out to Empower Work if they need your assistance?
The nice thing is people just text. You just go you can go on the website, which is empowerwork.org, and start a web chat. You just click on a bubble and you're connected in under 2 minutes. We ask you a couple of questions at first, and then we dive right in. Or just pick up the phone and text. There's nothing to download. There's nothing, there's no barrier to entry. And for us, that was really important, because if your boss puts a meeting on your calendar in 20 minutes and you're worried you're going to get fired, your friend may not be available, but that you can have a quick conversation with us.
Yeah. And what's the number that they text? Is that on the website?
It's on the website. So I would say go to the website, which is empowerwork.org. And it's also, if you're on a mobile browser, you can just click the number and your phone will just text it right away.
Okay, fantastic. And also, if people want to volunteer, they go to Empower Work and learn more about it there.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Also a great place to volunteer. And, folks are interested. We have a lot of folks who are interested in becoming better managers, or who are also thinking about do I want to become a coach? And we're a great opportunity to kind of explore we're a different version of coaching, but it's a great place to explore is this something that I might want to pursue?
Right. So tell me, how many people are you serving right now?
On any given day, it varies. We just passed 100,000 messages exchanged, which is a pretty exciting milestone. And we're almost to 50 states. We have South Dakota as a holdout. We've got Alaska covered, which is great. But we're a national service. And so, folks are in South Dakota, feel free to reach out. And on any given day, it varies. Sometimes we have days where we're, supporting like 20 to 40 people. Other days, Fridays are particularly quiet, which was surprising for us.
Yeah.
We thought like Fridays would be a high volume day. It's actually more of like a crickets day. And those are kind of interesting data trends for us. Like Tuesdays and Wednesdays, particularly in the morning, we see high volume. And other parts of the week that we thought would have been busier, we don't. So we're constantly learning.
Interesting. So how else do you measure success? You're looking at the numbers of people that are reaching out. What else are you looking at?
For us, one of the most important pieces is this support having an impact? And for us, impact would be people feel better after a conversation and hopefully are also able to take an action. And so we measure that in a couple of ways. One, we measure that in sentiment analysis in the conversation. Does the sentiment change as the conversation unfolds? We also measure that in post-use surveys. And so we ask folks, like, did you trust your volunteer? Did you feel better after the conversation? And then we have a follow-up survey that goes out to folks 1 to 2 weeks after their conversation. And in that, we see about 90% of folks say they still feel better, which is great, and that they've usually taken some kind of action, even if the situation is still in progress. They've at least addressed it in some way that feels right for them. And that's going to vary depending on every individual. Some people are going to determine, hey, I want to just leave this job. And so my plan of action is to start my job search, to update my resume. For some people, it's going to be, hey, as I mentioned, like I want to work with other coworkers and really change things internally. And each person, that's going to be different depending on what's going on for them.
Right. So I have a geeky question about how are you measuring sentiment during the interaction? Do you have a tool that you're using, or is it based on the volunteer's perspective?
We do a post, we do basically data analysis afterwards to sort of see like how did that sentiment change. And then we measure, I forgot to mention, I think I mentioned earlier, we measure things like completed conversation. And completed for us is that someone actively disengages. They let us know like, hey, I'm all set, or like, thanks for this. And those are some of the sentiment pieces too, where we'll see someone who's at a really tough moment. We had someone who was texting with the volunteer, and they knew they were walking into a conversation where they were ultimately going to lose their job, and it was highly emotional, obviously. And they paused in that highly charged moment and said to the volunteer, like, "Thank you so much for being here." And that that kind of moment really, I think, impacts our team and impacts the volunteers really profoundly, to say like, this is so, having that human connection in a way that really meets people where they are can have such a huge difference, can make such a huge difference in someone's life.
Yeah. So I would love to know about your transition from full-time employee, which we actually didn't talk about. Maybe you could share where you were you were working, or what your role was before EmpowerWork. And at what point did you make this is a big transition. So at what point did you feel comfortable doing that? Or maybe you never felt comfortable and you just did it anyway.
Yeah. I think being a founder is a constant state of discomfort.
Yes, I would agree. Yeah.
Getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. For me, it was when I started to see the survey results, when we were seeing the need, and I was like, oh my gosh, I would love to just like quit my job and work on this full time. And I have to say, I benefited from having a partner who has also been a founder. And we sat down and looked at the scenarios, and he said, look, I think you're onto something. This makes total sense. It's really great. And also, like, what do you think your milestones should be to quit your job? Because
there was some project planning going on there.
Good. Because he knew. Obviously, we live in San Francisco, and he had particularly started a nonprofit. He had done a nonprofit startup, and so we were both aware of both the challenges of any startup, as well as the particular challenges that can exist for nonprofit startups. whether that's, securing funding or getting things off the ground. There are a variety of challenges. And so we looked at that and said, okay, what makes sense for us, for our family? And even though I wanted to like immediately leave my job, we came up with a game plan to make sure that we had the sort of coverage that we needed. And I also really credit our board chair who, one of the first things that I did as soon as we started to see this data come in was to start thinking about like what sort of expertise did we need? Like legal expertise, we needed HR expertise, we needed folks who had background in coaching. We needed all of these different folks to come in and be part of this. And so it really kicked off this process of like bringing in the right advisors, bringing in the right folks. And ultimately, one of the folks who's been one of our biggest champions, who's now our board chair, and I sat down and she said, the most important thing for you as the founder is to make sure that you're set up for success. And she said, so like, what does that look like for you? And if you're stressed about your family's finances because you leave your job and you're working on this, like that's not going to set Empower Work up for success.
Right.
And so working on it on the side to get to the places that we needed to do to say like, hey, we're going to do this pilot. We want to understand the research. We want to do the pilot. Then we're going to start fundraising. We're going to identify the need. We're going to start the fundraising. We're going to start building things out, but in a way that I still had the coverage that I needed to take care of myself was really important. And so I credit Julie with that.
Right. Yeah. Where did your first funding come from?
We did, I would say sort of like a seed round, like a friends and family round, which was the first sort of like, I sent out just a million emails to everybody I knew who I thought would care about, who cared about healthy workplaces, who had been part of or advising in some way. And so we raised, I think like $10,000 from like just personal networks. And then I started having conversations with obviously larger funders as well. And so we were initially funded by Omidyar Network, and who actually, funnily enough, saw one of our ads. This is a crazy story, but my downstairs neighbor actually works at Clear Channel. And when I was doing some initial user testing, I was looking for transit shelter ads. And Andrew said, hey, like I think we can donate a couple of transit shelter ads. And I said, oh, I probably just need one. And he was like, no, you need like 10. And so they donated these transit shelter ads so that we could do user testing. And someone from Omidyar saw the transit shelter ad and contacted us and said, what you're doing looks really interesting. Can we have a conversation? And then we also had initial funding from the Pineapple Fund, which was an anonymous Bitcoin donor who was also kind of a crazy story. One of our board members texted me on a weekend and said, have you heard about this person who is giving away, like, I think at that point they'd said they were going to give away 65 million in Bitcoin to organizations. And I hadn't heard about it. And I looked on the website and I thought, okay, I think there's some alignment. I sent in an email to the person and said, look, you say you care about well-being, workplaces are at the center of that. Here's what we're thinking about. We haven't even launched, but if you, with your support, like we think we're onto something based on our pilot, and, would you help us launch this nationally? And the person responded within 3 days, asked a couple questions, asked a few more questions, and like a week later donated $100,000, which was incredible.
Yeah, congratulations. Was that the point at which you felt not comfortable? You felt okay making the leap?
I had left my job just prior to that. When I started to see that, when we were in conversations with funders and it looked like things were going to net out, then that's the point at which I left my job.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's always that point where you're like, do I go? Do I stay? And so what I tell people is, when it's harder to stay than it is to go, it's time to make the transition.
Yes.
Sometimes you just know in your gut, it's time.
Mm-hmm.
It's time. But it's also very helpful to have a partner who's supportive of the whole journey. And it sounds like you have that. So that's amazing.
It is. It makes a really big difference. And I think having someone who can understand, like, when you're so passionate about something and you're thinking about it, 24/7, even when you try to be really present and focused, like, oh, I'm totally 100% focused right now at this dinner, but like really I'm like thinking about this list of things that I want to do. Having a partner who can empathize with that and understand, and also who can be there when you get the no's, because you get a lot of no's, and who can say like, hey, that no might be an important no. It gives you some clarity and some definition. It's not the end all be all either.
Right. Yeah. Well, so Jaime-Alexis, how many employees do you currently have?
We have a small team. We just have 3 employees, and then we work with a range of contractors as well. And then we have hundreds of volunteers. So that's, I think that's part of the nice thing about our model is that we actually, I think we have this incredible community of folks who are really passionate and who give back, and that allows us to have a leaner team. I certainly would like it to be a little bit bigger, but we're growing in proportion to the need, and being really thoughtful about our spend.
Okay. And what's your current operating budget?
For this year, it's about $450 for 2019. For next year, though, to scale to where we want to grow. So as I mentioned, 40 million Americans don't have access to a resource. And our goal, we're building towards serving between 3 and 5 million people in the next 5 years. And so to do that, that means a lot of investment in our infrastructure, a lot of investment in our training to create scalable training, and really building out the system and infrastructure to support that growth. And so as part of that, next year, it's going to be about 1.2 million.
Okay. And if someone is interested in learning about funding and power work, how can they reach you? What's the best way for them to reach you?
Great question. I'm always open to other, pineapple funds.
Yeah. Who's out there? Come on. Contact Jaime-Alexis.
I should know, 40% of the folks that we serve are low wage or low wage workers or lower income. And so part of the reason why we're structured as a nonprofit is because we want to make sure that everybody has a resource. Simultaneously, we also see about 20% of folks donate after using our service. And even so, it's like people find such value that, even if they can only afford like $3 or $5, people make a really concerted effort to give afterwards. And that means a lot to us. So if someone wants to contribute and pay it forward, we can certainly, you're welcome to get in touch with me on our website, which is empowerwork.org, or email me. It's pretty easy. It's JaimeAlexis, no hyphen, @empowerwork.org.
Great. And I'll put that in the show notes too, so people can find it easily and get the spelling correct.
The Jaime spelling.
Yeah. So I have so many more questions to ask you, but we're almost out of time. So I'm going to cut it short. What are you most looking forward to in the future, in the next 12 months? What are you most looking forward to?
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, I think on a personal level, one of our team members has a really exciting personal life event. So she's becoming a parent. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing her step into parenthood, which will be really fantastic. Yeah. And then I think from an organizational perspective, I'm really excited. We have had a range of new researchers reaching out and saying like, hey, this is something I want to learn from. How can we understand worker voice a little bit better and really understand the issues and the needs that are coming up? And so I'm particularly excited about that. And I'm hoping that next year we're also going to start releasing some of our findings more widely to help inform some of these larger conversations that are happening. So really excited about that.
Great. And what would you say to someone who's thinking about starting a nonprofit organization? What are your words of wisdom for someone who's thinking about that journey?
I think for anyone, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, I always say, it sounds really like I always say, I think it's important to really follow the need and the gap. And that may be coming from I'm a pretty pragmatic person. I'm like, if there are like 5 other organizations doing the same thing, there's not a need.
Right.
And for me, it was really like, where's the gap? And what's the unique proposition or the unique value that we can offer
Right.
in this space. And I think particularly for a nonprofit, being really community centered, community driven, and that's been really important for us, both from those who we're supporting as well as our volunteers. Like our volunteers are part of that community. If we're not creating a great experience for them, if they're not feeling value out of giving back, then something's off, And we want to make
Yeah.
sure that's a big piece of it too. Like listening to that community need, co-developing in a way that works for folks. I find to be really valuable.
Right. Fantastic. Is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you'd like to share before we sign off?
I think the big piece I would say, I think I liked how you mentioned earlier, like there's something that we can all do. And I think part of it that I found really valuable is this, the main thing that I've learned so many things in the past 2 years, but one of the main things that I've caught myself doing differently is not asking have you questions to people in my life, whether it's like coworkers or friends or my partner, because I found that have you questions are advice hidden in a question mark, and that it really closes down the possibility for people ahead. So I would say if there's one thing that folks take away from this is like to ask questions with a what or a how at the beginning of the question, instead of saying like, have you talked to HR? Which is like, well, then the person's like, should I have talked to HR? Is that what I could have done? To like, what have you tried so far? Or what have you been thinking about? Which really just shifts the what someone might find possible going forward.
Completely agree. Yes, absolutely. It's hard to do that though, too. That, and I hear you saying that, and I've done lots of that training in my coach training, but sometimes though, you just find yourself asking those questions because you're used to doing it. But I think if you find yourself asking a have you question or why, also starting a question with why, just be aware of it and maybe you won't do it next time.
Exactly. It's like just I found myself like anytime I start a question with have you, I think like, oh wait, hold on, let me think about, can I reframe that in a different way?
Yeah, great advice. Great advice. Well, thanks so much. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for starting this organization, and thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Oh, I'm so glad that we got a chance to connect, and have really enjoyed this.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? Before we go, we have to say hello to Kevin Gottesman, who connected us at Got Ads, GOTT Ads, Got Ads, because Kevin is awesome. Back when I was at SOS Children's Villages, he did a lot of the digital marketing with us, advertising, and we've remained friends, and he introduced us. So shout out to Kevin. Hey, Kevin.
Absolutely. Hey, Kevin, thanks for the introduction. Kevin has been part of that community, I would say, who's helped get Empower work off the ground. So it's wonderful to have folks who are champions like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Lisa. You too.